So hi, I am Steve Fordham, filling in. Um, so I've never done a talk specifically on this. I'm not in HR. I may defer some questions later on to a couple of my colleagues who came in support tonight, who actually are recruiters for our consulting firm, Doherty Business Solutions. My role at Doherty, so we have 4 lines of service. We're a consulting firm that's here. We have offices in a number of cities around the U.S. St. Louis is our home office, but we work locally. And within the Atlanta office, we have 4 lines of service, one of them being software architecture and engineering, and I'm the practice lead for that line of service in Atlanta. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I've been doing this a long time. I started my career about 35 years ago. I was a summer engineer at what was Georgia Power Company. I think it's now just Southern Company, but I did that while I was at Georgia Tech, and I got my bachelor's and master's at Georgia Tech back then. I moved away, spent about 10 years as a full-time staff programmer working for IBM in their Federal Systems Division and then their Services Sector Division. So I've done that role where I was, on staff at a company in a development organization, writing code, doing designs, that kind of thing. And that's how I spent the first 10, 12 years of my career. Then my wife and I wanted to move back to Atlanta because that's where our families are both from. She's from Marietta. I grew up in Decatur. So we came back here, and I had 1 year up in the Northern Virginia area where I worked for IBM, where I had started to work for a small consulting firm. And I kind of liked that. So I looked for a job down here in consulting, and that's when I started with Doherty. Also spent 2 years since I've been back to Atlanta in a startup firm. So whatever shoes you fill right now in your role in software development, if that's your role, if you're a software developer, I've probably been in your shoes in one way or another in my career. So what I wanted to talk about tonight was in terms of maximizing your ability to get a job as a programmer. I'm not coming from the perspective of just like if you're new and trying to get your first job. I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about, once you've gotten past that milestone, which sometimes is depending on where industry is and where the market is, sometimes that's the hardest hurdle to cross. But I also want to talk about how do you maximize your opportunity to get a job all through your career, because that can be challenging in different ways at different times. So that's sort of the span of what I want to talk about. When you do that, what I found is a lot of this information is in my head. And the hardest thing for me to try to put this into a form that was cohesive in some way was to figure out what's the through line I want to use. Do I want to talk about how you maximize your opportunity over time? Or do I want to talk about, what are the different aspects you need to know and then talk about time? So anyway, I kind of organized it by time. But as far as where I'm coming from, so I haven't looked for a job in 18 years. So why am I doing this? The reason is because at our company, as far as the Atlanta market goes, I define, along with our recruiters, I define what our criteria is for hiring developers at all different levels. I help identify who would make a good programmer. We are a consulting firm, and that does shape a little bit of our hiring process. But actually, a lot of the things we look for in consultants that are somewhat unique to a consultant profile are also things that would make it easier for anybody to get a job as a programmer. So that's one thing I want to highlight as I go through this tonight. Anybody who gets hired by Doherty in Atlanta, unless I'm on an extended vacation or something, they also get interviewed by me. So I'm a part of the interviewing process. So when I talk about the things I talk about tonight, I'm also talking about it from the perspective of what I would be looking for in somebody, whatever the level of experience is that we're looking for, whether it's somebody very junior to somebody very senior. And we hire, this is not me marketing Doherty, I'm just saying we hire people at all different levels. And so that's the frame of reference that I'm coming from. So as we go through this, before I talk about the agenda, I'd like to make it as interactive as possible. If I do all the talking, I'm afraid you'll go to sleep and I won't feel very good about it afterwards. So feel free to raise your hand or just yell out, stop me anytime during this. I don't have all of the information that's in my head is not on the slides. I want to make this interactive and kind of address what you want to talk about with respect to this topic, any aspect of it. If we go off on a tangent, as long as everybody else is okay, I'm fine with, addressing anything. So any questions before I start? Okay. So what I am going to talk about within the context of this, what I plan to talk about are technical skills that you need to get hired, and that sort of differs a little bit as you go through your career and the level of job you're looking for. The kind of non-technical skills that you need, how to stay current or expand your capabilities as you go through your career, ways to build your network, and do all of the above, as I said, for all different points as you go through the career. What I don't plan on talking about, because I haven't been out there in the job market in 17 years, I wouldn't be the best person to tell you how to navigate the complexity that is the recruiting and staffing environment that's out there now. My son actually just went through this to get his first job as a programmer a little less than a year ago, and it was daunting as I saw it through his eyes, because now there are so many people out there, just doing their work, shopping resumes out and making phone calls to anybody who shows up on any of the job sites and collecting information to, fill out something to put in someone's database and on and on. It's daunting. If you have questions specific to that, at the end of my talk, if you want to, and if we have time, Esther and Steve, who are recruiters for Doherty, may be able to answer those kind of questions for you about recruiting firms and staffing firms and how best to navigate that or interact with them. So I didn't know ahead of time they were going to be here tonight, but that's a nice fallback if I can't answer your questions on those topics. Okay. All right. I decided to make the timeline of a career in software development as my through line for this. And I found this accidentally. I wasn't doing a ton of research for this. I kind of just wanted to do it from my experience. Since I interview people in this market, I figured that would be most relevant. But I thought this is actually a pretty good representation of what I've seen in my career and what I see in a lot of people's careers in terms of sort of your level of proficiency and expertise as you go through a career. Now, the timeline of 5, 10, 15 years and where you are on this curve from novice to export on this timeline may or may not match up with all of you. Some of it didn't match up exactly with me. There are some people who reach a level of more than just competent in 5 years, depending, part of that sort of luck of the draw, depending on how good a first job you get, how much that company invests in you in terms of training, whether or not you get on a particularly good job that exposes you to a lot of technology. There's a lot of variables in that. But generally speaking, if you get into software development and you have any passion for it at all, then, in your first 5 years, you're going to go from, only knowing what you learned in school or boot camp or whatever, and grow up this curve in the first 5 years until you get to the point where hopefully you're a competent programmer. Assuming you like the field and you stay in it over the next, now they say this Ben Shapiro, I want to give credit because I didn't come up with this. It just resonated with me in terms of what I've seen. From the 5 to 15 year period, you're still going up a curve and kind of reaching your peak of proficiency or expertise in the field. And again, some of that is tempered by how well you manage your career, but that should be the arc that your career takes from years 5 to 15 or somewhere in that span. And this is where how fast you get proficient or expertise. Again, even more matters on somewhat luck of the draw, what kind of job assignments you get, and how much you invest in your own learning and all that. But then what can tend to happen if you don't manage your career actively is, and even if you do, you tend to go in peaks and valleys. Because if you work, and there's a lot of things that contribute to that, but if you work in one organization or one project that you get comfortable in, or it's a really great project or a really great team and you stay with that because you're happy. Either you're just content or you're ecstatic and you don't want to leave that team, you don't want to leave what they're doing because of the technology, any number of factors. If you stay in that, then as you all know, I'm sure, at the rate of change that happens in this field that we're in, it's very, very easy to start to get stagnant and to start to lose your expertise, lose your proficiency, and you kind of have to always keep recharging. And so that's sort of a high-level view of the through line for the rest of what I want to talk about in terms of how to maximize your opportunity to get a job, keep a job as a programmer. So any questions so far? Okay. Yes. Oh, no, you're just adjusting the camera. All right. All right. So stage one, again, the duration on this is variable, but we're going to call it 0 to 5 years of experience. So just starting out. Now, I'm making an assumption here, and this is kind of based somewhat on the hiring requirements that we have at Doherty. It kind of matches up with the requirements that IBM had way back in the day, and the startup firm that I work for. But generally speaking, most companies are looking or prefer 4-year degree in computer science or a 4-year degree of some other kind plus an equivalent of a couple years of experience of programming, however you might have gotten that, or 4-year degree of any kind plus a programming boot camp or some kind of other intensive training program in software. And so I'm kind of assuming for the purposes of this talk tonight that you fall into one of those categories. And if you don't, I have some experience with this from some of the junior engineers that we've hired. And if you want to ask questions about how to navigate, getting to this first starting point in terms of training or education, I'm happy to talk about that. But for now, I'm assuming that most of you are past that and looking for what's next. Fair? Okay. All right. So now everything else or most of what I say after this may start to get into a little bit of a religious-y topics. And that's okay. Fine if people want to disagree. And I am admittedly old school. What am I now? 58. And I've been doing this for 35 years. But I do try to keep current. I looked again today just to make sure I wasn't completely out to lunch at the TIOBE index. I have a link to that. I'm sure most of you probably know what it is, but if you don't, I'll speak to that later. And what I want to say is, if you're just starting your career, and or if I don't think if you fall into this category from the nods that I saw, but if you were looking for like what kind of boot camp to get into. Foundationally, I think you're setting yourself up best to start a career in your first job in one of these platform choices and one of these language choices, because they're more ubiquitous, especially in the Atlanta market, and easier to get a job in these areas than others. Now, there are a lot of other languages out there that are gaining currency right now. I know, like Go and R. Python is like way up the list. I didn't put Python here because it's been around for a long time. A good friend of mine who, if you were ever a fan of the Java Posse, anybody remember the Java Posse? Anybody remember the name Dick Wall, the English guy? One of my best friends. He worked in Atlanta. He worked for my wife. My wife used to be a VP of technology in Atlanta. I think Laura used to work for her for a short period of time at UPS. And so I got to know Dick through that, and Dick's a great guy. And he was always on the leading edge of everything. And he told me about Python when he and I first worked together in like 1995 or 6. So I learned Python back then. I've been doing Python. That's been the scripting language on every laptop that I've gotten since then. But I think foundationally, in terms of learning a foundational language where you see like sort of a current or best practice standard implementations of things like object orientation and aspect-oriented programming and error handling and on, getting the richness of what a language can do and how to make effective use of it, I think these are good starting foundational places to be. There's obviously great reason and places for lots of other languages, but if I were recommending to someone starting their career, I would want to at least get an immersion in one of these platforms and languages first. So that's where I would start. And I'm open to differences of opinion, because I don't want to give my view on the world and not leave room for other views. Okay. Second thing would be also to add, and the reason I'm going through this, and a lot of you may already either sort of know this or may already have this experience, but if any of you are relatively new in your career, these are things that from a perspective when I'm looking to hire somebody as a junior engineer, I'm looking for that foundational language and that foundational platform, because from that, if they have a sharp active mind and they're eager in their career, they can take the knowledge they learn in one of those platforms or languages and it translates well to learning other things, which is why I want to start there. In addition to that, with that being the core foundation, the next thing would be learning a source code repository. I used to say either Git or SVN, but it's kind of, the pendulum has swung so much now that I would say learn Git. And if you go to a client or a company that's still using SVN, okay, fine, you can learn it pretty quick. Learn SQL. I know there's a lot of companies that are using NoSQL databases of all different kinds, but it's still kind of a foundational thing to understand what a relational database is, why they were ever come up with, why they work the way they do. And if you know that, then you can understand the rationale for NoSQL databases in a more primary way. And you know how most jobs that you're going to look for are going to have, at some point, you're going to have to be working with systems that are based on SQL databases. And so you kind of need that skill in your toolbox. So that's another foundational skill. I also think you want to, at this point, again, the world has gone so far towards Agile that I would recommend people foundationally learn about what the Agile methodology is about. When people ask, I recommend the book Learning Agile by Stillman and Green. There are tons of good books out there. There are books that are, if you want to learn specifically like Scrum, like there's 2 or 3 books that are the Bibles on Scrum that you could look to. But if somebody's just wanting to learn Agile in general and you don't know for sure whether the job you're looking for is going to want to do Scrum or XP or or Kanban or Lean or some other variant, that book does a good job of explaining it all at a level where you can know the terminology and know the basic why someone would choose one versus the other and how they generally work. But that's another foundational building block, because without that, you kind of don't know how to operate in a team environment in a job. And then the other thing that not everybody we hire has done this, but the kind of like the next building block as a foundational thing that I would add as a foundational skill when you're starting out is just learn some really basic principles. Clean Code is a book that a lot of people reference. There are other books that are of a similar nature, but it's basically sort of the core basics of what is good design, what is good code, what are good coding practices, and anti-patterns to avoid. And if you at least start there, you kind of start to get an idea of not just here's a language and here's an OO framework and a bunch of classes or whatever the language is. You also start to see how to use those effectively and what is misuse and how to avoid it. And so I always recommend some kind of a primer like Clean Code, and then the Design Patterns book. And there are many other maybe more user-friendly version of the design that describe design patterns. I like the one by Head First. I kind of like those books that like jar your brain like that. So I actually like that I recommend it as well. But the original book done by a bunch of IBMers was good too. And then learning test-driven development is also sort of a foundational thing. Unfortunately, not everybody does it, but I'd rather have a person coming into a company understand it and sort of inculcate it from the bottom up if they can. So that to me is another foundational piece. Any questions or anything anybody else would add to that list? Yeah.
I would maybe add some cloud technology, but whether that's foundation or a next step, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So I'm actually seeing most of the young people coming out of college have it table stakes. Mm-hmm. They're given free accounts for at least half of their senior year classes, and they come in talking to Amazon, and talking Google before they even get into this stuff, because this is the next, how do we really actually educate them after their education?
Right. Yeah, and we actually have started doing a boot camp where we go through everything but SQL, we kind of do a boot camp on all of this for all of our new hires, because to your point, that's not something, because they're not in a team environment and a work environment where this kind of stuff is as critical. They don't get as much of that. I debated on cloud technology, on containerized services, microservices, and I debated, like, where do those fold into this process? I didn't refer to cloud specifically. That was a miss on my part. I do have something later where I mentioned things like microservices, containers, and that is, like, foundationally, I feel like those kinds of things, cloud being maybe a bigger seismic shift, but there are things like that have been evolving over the course of my career anyway, from just service-oriented architecture to microservices, cloud technology, and so forth, that if you understand the basics of how to write good code, then as those things come and ebb and flow and things change, at least at the core, you still know how to do good design, and you'll appreciate how, as you learn about what the cloud can do and so forth, you are in a better position to use it effectively rather than misuse it. And so I do mention that later on, sort of like the next phase of your career after you got the foundational stuff done. If you're lucky, the way I look at it is, if you, in any job you would be starting now in the first 5 years, you'll probably be doing work with cloud technology, most likely. You'll probably odds are getting to the point where it's pretty good chance, unless you're working for an older company that has a lot of legacy code, that you'll be doing microservices and containers and so forth. If you're really lucky, you might be in a place where they're actually doing DevOps and approaching DevOps maturity. But those kinds of things will come along with the job as you go, and I'm going to talk later about what if they don't.
So a quick comment on clean code.
Yeah.
Interesting timing. We kicked off our yearly book club using clean code. Half the people who showed up were a year or 2 years less new into the company, and I asked all my architects to come, and they had some great debates on the first 3 chapters today.
Yeah.
So it's not just entry level on that one.
Yeah.
And a couple of senior guys reminded me that they hadn't read it in 5 or 6 years, and we're going back and going, oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't agree with everything Uncle Bob says.
But that's why I asked my senior guys to come, because a lot of good discussions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, we have had similar discussions, but most of the times, like the Novice program, the freshers, they get passionate about what's been said in the clean code, and they want to implement it so bad, and they end up breaking the system sometimes. And, you need to handhold them in certain levels. Okay, slow it down.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we picked it up because the teams that are really big proponents of what's in there were making really uncomfortable code reviews with the young people, the new employees, because, hey, that method name is way too short. But the code works.
Yeah.
Way too short. Trust me, in a year you're going to hate that name. But the code works. And then 3-4 iterations, which just should have been one of, okay, this looks great, off we go. And we realized, wait, we haven't done this in a while. So we're going to reset and kick off a new book club starting with that.
Yeah. And, again, there may be religious differences on this, but I mean, I'm just hearing from somebody who's a new developer. I just heard this comment yesterday. They're having to go back and decipher something. It was a ticket on a system with a lot of legacy code where the original developer ended up leaving the team, and either the customer evolved in what they wanted, probably, or the developer didn't have a chance to finish the ticket. So now the new developer, who's only a year into his career, is having to go and debug and try to decipher that. And if the people who had written that code had read clean code and adhered to the naming, this person would be so much happier right now. So, it's worth, it's worth having that conversation, having the argument, so that you understand the premise behind it. Yes.
Don't throw anything at me, but is anybody using TFS as a code repo?
Good question. Is anybody using TFS in this audience?
Team Foundation Service, a Microsoft product.
Yeah, Team
We're actually working on a Java project, but because the company has so many products and stuff, they have a single enterprise solution, which is TFS.
Yeah, and I've used Team Foundation. So we're kind of technology or solution neutral, agnostic, whatever. And there's not a lot of .NET work going on right now in our clients. We have 2 projects that we're working on right now, 2 different clients that are .NET based. One of them is using TFS. I think the other one is using either Git or SVN. But we have used TFS. I mean, and it had been, at the time I was using it last, which is about 5 or 6 years ago, it had been improving drastically, and it's great if you're living in especially if you're living in a Microsoft environment. What you can do with it, with the whole test suite integration and everything built in, it's really cool.
But it's not a huge market share, basically.
It's at least what I see, and you guys tell me, but in the Atlanta market, and most of our clients are Fortune 500, big companies in Atlanta. We have a few smaller ones, but there's not that much .NET that we see going on right now. Yeah, most are on Git. Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Focus areas for experience. This is starting out with, what if you don't have any on-the-job experience and you're trying to get over that hurdle to get hired? And even if you do, this is still not bad advice. One is programming kata, a term I learned from Ms. Laura Moore. And I found out there's really cool websites out there. It's basically just, how many of you do technical interviews? Just out of curiosity. How many of you ask developers to do FizzBuzz or Fibonacci sequences okay. Anyway, there are hundreds of different exercises that are like that, but different, so that you're not always asking the same question. And for every one of them, there's there's maybe, depending on the language, there may be sort of a best practice way to do it, but there's 18 different ways to do it. And the process of going through that kind of exercise, where on a regular basis you go back and revisit the same problem, don't look at your old solution, and solve it, and then try to solve it a different way, use a different feature of the language. Like I had somebody the other day, I'll give away my secret. One of the things I ask people to do is reverse a string, which sounds trivial. You'd be surprised how many people, even more senior developers, trip on that because they've just forgotten how to do basic logic because they're always calling services. And I had somebody for the first time, and maybe this is an obvious solution, but somebody for the first time used a stack and pushed the string onto the stack one by one and then popped it off. I'm like, well, that's cool. That's innovative. I didn't think of that. But that idea of just sort of doing mental gymnastics around code is a great way to prep for interviews, because whatever test question you might be given, even if it's something more complex than that, it kind of gets your brain to get more elastic than the work you're doing every day. Contributing to open source, yes.
Question there. So, what do you prefer? Ask them to write a code on the board, or to give a laptop and make them?
Both, either or.
Which one do you prefer?
So, for some context, I prefer doing it on the board. And for me, context-wise, there's 2 reasons for that. One is that the nature of my interviewing, I'm not the detailed technical screener for our company. I'm sort of the backup. And I'm interviewing from a slightly different perspective. I'm looking for fit with the company. I'm doing just sort of a spot check to get my own feel for their technical acumen, sort of just in case, and to get my own feel for it. So for that reason, I don't want to have to go through the hoops of making sure that things are set up with an environment and to sit them down and have them go through anything like that. That's one reason. The second reason is that different people react differently. Some people, I think, are more comfortable when they sit down at a computer with a terminal. Some people are more comfortable when they don't have to deal with the specific nuances of the compilers barking at me. I'm not used to this editor. I'm not used to this particular version of the language or whatever. And I just want to see that they can think through the logic and demonstrate the logic. And if they don't remember to put a semicolon in the right place, or if they don't remember the method name, I really don't care. I know they can Google. I hope they can Google, or use Stack Overflow or whatever. So that's why, for me, the board actually kind of works better, because it just lets them think and demonstrate they can think. We also have come up with it tests a completely different thing, and we do it in our tech screens, and it's actually starting to work pretty well. We do a an online or an at computer exercise, and I'm not going to give away the details because I feel like it's kind of a little bit of a trade secret, but it's cool because it kind of allows the candidate to demonstrate a number of these different foundational skills, not just writing code. And so we've started to integrate that into our practices. So I think there's a place for both.
I also like on the whiteboard because if you're doing it right, they are talking to you.
Absolutely.
Whereas at a screen, they are heads down. They're not making a joke about, I can't remember what the name of the method is. They're panicking looking at the screen.
Right.
And they're more likely to talk about experiences and I like that much better.
Yeah.
How about a projector connected to a computer? You can look at what they type and talk.
Yeah.
It's the
I
same
mean,
problem. 'Cause
I've seen people more comfortable with a computer than Word. Probably it's because they don't write much, and when they can even hack it.
I would also say it's also the what you're hiring for. I mean, if you're hiring a junior developer, they're probably going to be more apt to be more intimidated by a board than a laptop. And that's where maybe a pair programming aspect, where you got two screens, or one screen, two people working at it. Whether if you're a mid-level to a senior developer, you've already been up the board enough, I hope, enough that you can go in and talk through a problem. So to me, it's when I used to interview, that was kind of the guard is like if I had like a junior developer, I'd have them go, so like test their SQL acumen, right? Okay, write me this query, and they would, so you could type, you could write on the board, but most of the time they don't want to type it. But as you get more gray hair or less hair, they like the board a little bit better. So to me, it's but I'm like you. I want to hear them talk.
Yeah, my counter is when I mentored, let's see, we did 50 interviews with interns last year in the role I'm in. I mentor college kids. I tell them start with a whiteboard because you can then do a TDD kind of thing on a whiteboard much, much easier than in a computer because you can take a step to the right, put test number 1, write out your test, and as soon as you see somebody doing it, they get all that foundation stuff you just did.
Yeah.
But when they're at a computer, you open a new file, you scroll down to the bottom and put your test names there. It's just easier when I can take 10 linear feet to explain what I'm about to go do.
Yeah.
And that helps them also be a little more calm if they made a mistake.
Yeah.
Because they've covered 9 out of the 10 things, not, oh my God, I missed something.
Yeah. And I'll tell you 2 anecdotes. How relevant they are, you can decide. But one is, some of you are old enough to remember Jim Borland Software. So way back in the day, one of the first sort of integrated development environments that was made popular for PCs was Borland Pascal or Borland Turbo Pascal. That's right. Thank you, Turbo Pascal. It's been long enough that I've forgotten. And the story I've heard is that Jim Borland was this programmer who lived in like Oregon or Washington State, one or the other. And he got the idea that, for building an integrated development environment for a PC, for a mass audience, with Pascal as a programming language, and he went off into the woods and he went hiking it as he was wont to do, and went camping and basically designed the whole thing, the compiler, the IDE, and everything in his head, and then came back and wrote the code. And similarly, if you, maybe not everybody is like this, but for me, if I try to start with PowerPoint to do a presentation, and this is not an example of my best presentation, I'm telling you, I had to get some notes down so I could talk through this. I can do better visual presentation than this, believe me. But when I want to do that, if I start at a laptop, if I start with PowerPoint up, it's going to be worse. It's way better on a whiteboard or a pencil and paper because it frees your brain. You're not locked into what I can do with the PC or what the PC can do for me. You're just thinking creatively. And by the same token, every time I've found a design problem when I'm writing code or trying to design something and I get stuck, and everybody has their own means of getting unstuck, I go for a walk. The system that I designed, that I just personally am most proud of in terms of how I came up with it, what it was when it was finished, how well it worked, was mostly designed, the hard parts were designed walking around Piedmont Park near where my client was. And then I would come back with the idea unstuck and go finish writing the code. So again, I think whiteboards allow for that creative space that sometimes being now people also need to be able to basically stand and deliver at a keyboard at some point. So I think there's room for both, but I don't think you should necessarily throw out using a whiteboard for a lot of reasons. Okay. And then last thing, especially if you're in, and all of this is true whether you're trying to get your first job or going beyond that, is to, if you're investigating, what I try to, like one of my responsibilities is to help mentor our software engineers and help them annually as they set goals for what they want to accomplish. And I mean, goal setting is not a particularly complex thing, but one of the things you always want to do is set something tangible that is, you can define that I have succeeded because I can demonstrate that I accomplished the goal either to myself or to someone else because I can show them this, right? And so whatever you want to learn, and that's one of the things that's woven through this, is to maximize your employability, the ability to go get the next job you want or the next job you have to go get. You want to make sure that you're maintaining your skill set, learning new things, learning other things, and so forth. And I would really encourage you to, especially now since you can get your own free Bitbucket account or GitHub account or whatever, to create your own repository, create your own portfolio that's demonstrable. Whether it's a pretty UI, if that's if that's in your skill set and you can do that, or even if it's just back-end stuff and all you can do is kind of show an ugly screen dump of what it does, you at least have something that you did and you can demonstrate it. And people can go out if you allow them, if they're considering hiring you, you can let them go and get read-only access to the repository and see that, yeah, this guy wrote this code, or this gal wrote this code. So build your own demonstrable portfolio of code as you go, so that you have something tangible that you can basically put a marker in the sand to yourself. I did this. I've done it. I've mastered this, and you can also then demonstrate that to other people. Okay. Last, network. This is going to be monotonous because I'm going to say this like 3 times. Get on LinkedIn. I know there are other things. There's Glassdoor and other things, but from what I see, my perspective, the one that's ubiquitous is LinkedIn. There may be others too, but LinkedIn, everybody seems to be on it. Business people, technical people, everybody. Get a LinkedIn account if you don't have one already. Connect with every person you know, as long as there's somebody that you'd want to be in your network, whether they're a carpenter or the person that cuts your hair. Everybody you know could be an asset in your job search. Absolutely everybody you know. So if you know them and you're willing to be a reference for them, either a character reference or a skill reference, and vice versa, get everybody you know on LinkedIn and keep doing that. Now, as a consultant, any of you who are consultants, you have kind of a built-in advantage because every time you go from one client to the next, you add 10, 20, 50, 100 people that you can add to your network. If you don't do that, if you're in a single company on staff as a developer, your access to additional people is somewhat more limited. But when you come, like in somewhere down here, also attend meetings like this one. When you come to meetings like this, when you go to DevNexus, anywhere else you go, get connected to people. If they know you at all, if they know your name, if they know your face, if you had a halfway sociable conversation with them and they're willing to link with you on LinkedIn, it's better to know people than to go in cold. And I can't repeat that enough. Every company who looks at you and contacts you in relation to a job that they're trying to hire for, or every company that you look at that's advertising a job that you want, check that against your LinkedIn connections. And if you have somebody who's a first-hand connection, see if they have some way of getting your name in front of somebody there who can get you past the gatekeepers, like Steve and Esther. They're really not gatekeepers like that. Okay. All right. after you have your first job, and the later sections, as you get more experience in your career, won't take as much time because a lot of it is rinse and repeat. There's just some nuanced things to add to it. After you have your first job, a few other things. Obviously, one thing that you have to put in the time. Get hands-on experience. I mean, you're there, you're doing the job. I actually had somebody, I was in a conversation this morning, and somebody said the best advice they ever got was, when you start a job, just shut up and do it. And I'm not advocating that you put up with anything that's really horrible or anything, but whatever you're given to do it and do it well, and learn whatever you can from it. It may or may not encompass all the things that you need to learn to round out your skill set. So, but the first thing is get that hands-on experience. There are things that you will learn, whether it's your job or whether it's something that your team is doing, where you go to put something into production the first time and you find out, as all of us have at one point or another, that somebody says, well, I didn't change anything. And then a half an hour or a half a day or a half a week later, somebody says, well, yeah, I did change that over there, but that couldn't have affected this. Yeah, I can. And that's just one, kind of obvious example of things happen that you learn by experience that it's kind of really hard to just read in a book and absorb. So, just put in the time, get the experience, and then while you're doing that, and this applies whether you're, very moving on in your career, but especially in the first few years, you start off and you may be doing like more support tasks than you are doing new development. You may be kind of locked into one area, like because they needed somebody to do back-end service development. That's what you're doing. You're not getting to do any front-end work or whatever. Figure out where you want to be next year and 5 years from now in terms of the kind of developer you want to be, whether you want to be full stack or whether you want to be all back end but polyglot in terms of languages. Figure out where you want to be and then take active steps to get there. And that may mean investing your own time. And that's something that we all have to figure out if we have other obligations, family, etc., or whatever. But I think most people, unless you were very lucky in the jobs that you had and how they kind of dovetailed one after another, to get anywhere in your career beyond where you're at, you kind of have to invest some of your own time. And that's getting easier and easier to do with being able to have your own either free or inexpensive cloud access to set up environments that used to be the kind of thing that you could only really afford to do in a work environment, and things like that. And then look for sources of learning. So one of the things, so this bullet here about continuing to develop foundational skills, even if they're not part of your current job. So out of the things that we talked about being foundational and whatever other things you would consider foundational, if you're not doing them in your first job or it's something you haven't done before, I would just kind of keep a list in the back and set a goal each quarter or each year that I'm going to go and do what it takes to master SQL, or at least get proficient in SQL in this quarter, and then figure out some kind of cadence to do that, come up with a goal, come up with something to plop in your portfolio to demonstrate that you've done it. And then for sources of learning, you probably all already, you can get access to information on YouTube, you can get, Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow, whatever. If you want to put a little money into it, you can get, and your employer may help out with this, you can get access to good videos through Pluralsight. Safari Books Online is great. My company had it. They switched to something else, which really sucked, and then they gave it back to us, and I was overjoyed. So we have that. Burke and I both lamented when that went away. Udemy, Coursera, user groups and conferences like Ajug. And there's a ton of other ways that you can get information, but the main thing is kind of target those foundational things that you want to learn, whether it's broadening the platforms that you know, adding a new language that you didn't know before, adding a new database type, learning Cassandra or HBase or whatever. Make a goal and keep adding to what is in your skill base. and then network and continue to do that. Okay. Yeah.
Something I'd like to add.
Yeah.
If you've gotten into your language or you're like approaching senior development, there's a website called Pact that offers a random free book from their site every day. So you can get little books on certain topics that you might not have thought about learning about, like generating better front-end .NET code or making a stronger SQL database.
Cool. How do you spell that? Pact.
P-A-C-K-T.
Okay. Cool. There you go. An extra resource.
You talk about mentoring at all?
Later. Yeah.
That's another thing for the first job. Find yourself a mentor, official.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you brought that up now, because I kind of talked about it one way, which is later on, you need to become a mentor. Well, you don't have to, but I recommend it highly. But yeah, the flip side of that is, at this stage in your career, that's a great idea. Find a mentor, whether it's a formal program that your employer has, or whether it's informal. Find somebody that you have a rapport with, whose work you respect, and it can be as formal or informal as you can make it. But have somebody who is willing to kind of help coach you through as you get started, and kind of point out the minefields. Maybe if you're willing to, and they're willing to, you can set goals with them, and they can help hold you accountable. Whatever it takes to help you accomplish your goals.
I had a junior developer less than a year out of school in the elevator one day go, "What are you working on?" And 6 years later, I meet with him twice a month now.
Yeah.
Just because he asked me, I'm like, "Hey, I talked about this," and he then went and read about it. So the next time he saw me in the elevator, said, "Hey, I read about," in those days it was Spark. "Hey, I read about Spark." "Oh, cool." And I was talking. He's a completely different department. Doesn't even work in our organization.
Yeah.
And yet, 6 years later, we still meet every other week, and I think I learn as much from him some days as he learns from me.
I was just going to say, a lot of times even if you've been in the business for a long period of time, mentorship is working with a peer and sharing with a peer and finding out what they're doing and kind of feeding off of that. That peer, a lot of times, they can teach you things that like, I didn't know that, or I didn't think about that. And that's an awesome thing.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, and I'll talk more about the mentor side of that in a few minutes. All right. So stage 2. So now we moved on to whether you think it's 5 to 10 years, 5 to 15 years, you're sort of in that middle part of your career where you've gotten some foundational stuff underway. What do you do to, again, maximize the potential to either get that other job in your own organization, get another job somewhere else, whatever. How do you maintain your edge? How do you stay as employable as possible? So let's talk about additional capabilities. Some of this, again, the timeline on this varies from person to person and sort of how your career happens to unfold. But as you hit the 5-year mark, you've gotten proficient at taking an assignment and maybe probably taking some amount of, or maybe a large amount of design guidance, and you go and you write, hopefully by this point, very effective code to implement whatever you've been asked to implement. As you get to this point in your career and progress onwards from 5 to 10 to 15 years or whatever, there's some additional capabilities that are important, some of which fall well within the comfort zone of the traditional, and I'm not real big into stereotypes, but the traditional stereotype of a programmer being more introverted than extroverted and liking to be in front of their computer. So the first one still fits within that category, ability to design and write clean code. So you've read clean code, but you need to be able to take on larger scale systems, more complex problems, and understand how to effectively break that down using whatever tools and techniques are current, and start to learn how to fit appropriately. Is this something that needs to be container based, or would that be overkill because this is a temporary thing that we're just throwing together for a short-term purpose? Or there's some integrations involved in this, and do those integrations need to be real-time? Can they be batch? Can they be file-based? Do they need to be pub-sub, et cetera, et cetera? At this point, you're starting, and you may have gotten some of that in the individual assignments that you got earlier in the start of your career, but now you're beginning to have responsibility for making those decisions yourself and doing those kinds of evaluations. So, and again, there are plenty of books that talk about design. Robert Martin's written some of them. There are plenty of others that talk about effective design, effective architecture, anti-patterns, patterns, etc. So that's the kind of information that I would be absorbing through reading and taking training and mentors and so forth. In addition to that, and this is something that I place a strong premium on in terms of consulting, but that's, as I said earlier, some of the strengths that a consultant needs to have are things that benefit anybody in trying to maintain their marketability. The ability to communicate is huge. The ability to communicate effectively with your technical peers, that's probably the easiest thing to do, probably, because you're working with them every day, you're kind of doing the same work. That should theoretically be relatively easy. But also learning to communicate to customers, and not just to talk to them in the same way you talk to your peers, but learning how, if you do have access to customers directly, how do I talk with them? How do I listen to them in a way that needs to be different in a lot of cases to how I would interact and listen to my peers? How do I do that effectively? How do I talk to management, either my immediate manager or higher level management? Do I communicate the same information to them in the same way? Or do I need to think about how maybe to roll it up? Because they don't have time to listen, nor do they care to listen to the down in the weeds explanation of how this microsurface is failing because of this, because of this, because of this. How do I roll that up and give them the information they need? How do I communicate, if you're looking for a job, how do I communicate to a recruiter or to an interview to communicate who I am and what skills I bring to the table? One of the critical things here that actually just popped into my head, but it's actually very relevant to what we're talking about tonight, is there's a bit of an art to this, but I just want to put it in your heads as something to think about. And again, experience will bring this to the forefront more and more as you go through your career. But you always need to learn the art of how to honestly, no false spin, no dishonesty, but you need to learn how to effectively take what you have learned in your career, take those things that you've gained expertise at, listen to what an interviewer is asking you to describe in terms of, have you done, a lot of times the question is, have you done this? And that's not a great question because it's a yes/no question. But if they ask you, tell me about a time when you did something like this, like more of a behavioral interviewing question. If you haven't done exactly that, one of the skills to being an effective interview candidate is, how do I take what I have learned that I am pretty sure or positive is relevant to what they're asking, where I can demonstrate that even though I haven't done exactly that, I have the experience in my toolkit already that I would be able to do that or learn that almost immediately. That is something that you should be able to do, not all the time, but it's a very, very relevant interviewing skill. And some people are good at it, and you get better at it the more you go on in your career, because you end up in your job situations having to relate something new that's coming at you to something that you've done in the past that's similar but not the same. But as you go into interviews, kind of be thinking that way. Your mind needs to be a bit agile. Not to harp on the methodology, I'm just using the word in its normal way. Your mind needs to be agile in being able to say, I haven't done that, but here's what I've done that's relevant that will help you see that I have the right skills to do the job you're asking me to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's kind of double-edged sword there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, interviewing people in the past, I've also gotten to where you ask them this, and they know they haven't done it, but then they kind of say, oh yeah, well this, and this, without kind of acknowledging they haven't done it. So then there's the question of,
right,
did you even understand the question? Is there a communication issue, or is it that you're trying to do that? So that's the honesty portion of what
that's a good point. And somebody could make that mistake without intending to be dishonest, and that's true. You do need to acknowledge, no, I haven't done exactly that. But let me tell you about this that I think is, and the thing is, you need to be able to, in order to use this technique, you need to be able to explain how these things that I am describing that I have done are relevant to the question you asked. If you can't do that, then you have failed.
Yeah, I just interviewing a lot of people is, a lot of times it's, people want to talk, just they don't want dead air and silence. So they'll if they can't answer the question you ask, they'll answer a question they know they can answer, even though it may not be relevant. So
And
it's just something to be careful of, because that can kind of tinge the interview a certain way, or it's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay,
And if,
red flag.
good point. And if I'm interviewing, especially if, regardless of your level, but especially if it's somebody more senior, I'm actually happy, because in senior level interviews, I'm asking a lot more questions. I'm spending more time because there's a lot more, you're investing in making sure that it's a good fit. And I actually hope, I'm not trying to stump them, but I actually hope there's a point where they say, no, I haven't done that. Or no, I don't know what that is. Because then they've just confessed to me, or they've just demonstrated to me, I can be brutally honest when it's not in my best interest. And that's a good trait. So, yeah. Okay. All right. And then finally, in writing, and this goes for both text, and I mentioned UML. And a lot of you who've been doing Agile since the day you started your career may or may not have ever learned UML. You will find from a marketability perspective that sooner or later there may be a company that you want to work for that wants to create an architecture document or communicate a design that needs to be sort of to take a snapshot of what was decided at a point in time that can be shared in a way that can be consumed by a lot of different people in a way that is done in a common language. I'm describing UML. And if you haven't learned it, I've heard the argument that you don't need all that documentation in Agile. Agile is supposed to be more lightweight. And in a lot of cases that may be true. But even in that case, there are times when you're trying to just kind of like sketch out an idea in an Agile design where just knowing how to do a sequence diagram is a very effective tool to use. Or knowing how to do a quick class diagram or a state diagram is actually a very useful thing if you're doing like test-driven development, or you're trying to capture a complex small piece of a system to figure out how to design it. So if you haven't learned UML, if you don't know what it is, I strongly recommend getting a book on it. There's one called UML Distilled that is very short, that big, and gives you the basic concepts, and is really worth learning. And it will help you in communicating design documents to team members who need to build something, or to just capture, this is what the design is. Okay, so that's about, and communication, if you're introverted, or if you're not, but you're getting the energetic version of me tonight. I am an introvert. I will go home and crash because I will be exhausted from talking to you tonight. Burke and Laura know this because I've worked with them before. And I'm actually much more comfortable and I like to think funnier and more engaging when I'm in a room with like 5 or 6 people that I've known for a while, and we're doing work and talking, and that's my environment. That's my happy place, or by myself.
If you like to present, this is the experience level to start presenting.
Yeah,
Come to Ajug and say, hey, I'd like to spend a 5-minute talk about X, Y, and Z.
absolutely.
Lightning talks this August.
Yeah. So if you're if your comfort zone is just to sort of be at your desk writing code, I still can't recommend highly enough that it is still worth it, even though it might be painful to push yourself out of your comfort zone and do something like this, do a presentation, do a talk. If your organization has Toastmasters, that's a great way to do that. If your company doesn't have a Toastmasters chapter, you can find them around town, and that's a great way to kind of do extemporaneous speaking of different styles and so forth, and get yourself comfortable with it. It may be painful, but it's worth it. The first time I ever really had to do this, I did it like everybody did, doing speeches in high school and stuff like that. But I signed up when I was a sophomore in college, and I took a bunch of classes in joint enrollment in college. It wasn't that I was that smart. My high school didn't offer calculus, so I took classes on the DeKalb College, which is now Georgia Community College. Anyway, Perimeter. Yeah, it's now right. Georgia State absorbed it. Okay, so anyway, back when it was DeKalb College, and I took a bunch of joint enrollment. So when I got to Georgia Tech, I was already like a year and a quarter into the degree stuff I needed to do with a couple of exceptions. And so when I was a sophomore, I was actually qualified based on the math classes I'd taken to be a teaching assistant in the math department. And so I'm basically still 18, and I walk up to a class of 50 freshmen in a lecture hall, and I'm supposed to deliver the first chapter lecture on Calculus 101. And they have these big glass doors in the Skiles classroom building, big glass transom that you could see through. I got up to the door and I saw the classroom, like, double the size of you guys, and froze. And I almost bailed. I literally almost bailed. And I thought that would be such a colossal fail. And so I put my head down, opened the door, walked in. I looked up for a half a second and said, "Hello, I'm Steve Fordham. I'm your TA. Let's start with chapter 1. Turned around. I did have a lecture prepared. And my back it was a chalkboard back then. I don't think they had whiteboards at Georgia Tech yet. And my back was to them for the whole time, because that's just how nervous I was in that big of an audience. Now, I've come a long way, and anybody can do it. So if you're not comfortable communicating verbally, it's a huge skill to have, which will help you in interviews and everywhere else. So I harp on that because I care. All right, a couple of other things. Again, this is in the 5 to 15 year. You need to learn how to organize your work. So you need to learn how to estimate. We have tools internally that we use that sort of automate the estimation process. But there are just sort of basic heuristics you can do based on your own experience. Your company may have some sort of heuristics about how to estimate. If you're doing Agile and you're on an Agile team and you're doing it halfway right, then you're going to be kind of evolving to a story point cadence and doing story point estimation or some kind of estimation tool like that, where you're approximating the size of each piece of work you're committing to do and so on. And then you learn from that and do retrospectives. So hopefully that's doing Agile that's built into your learning process, but that is something that you need to figure out how to do. And if you're not always working within the environment of the same organization, you're going to find that some people are going to want to ask you some target for, like, okay, I hear you want to do, I hear we're going to do this Agile, and so that means we're committing in X week increments, 2 week increments or whatever, and then we replan and do the next and the next. But how long do you think it's going to take? That people will ask you for that answer, and you will be better served if you are able to at least tell them, I promise you the answer I give you is not going to be accurate, but this is based on my experience. This is how long I think it might take if the requirements don't change, and caveat, caveat, caveat. There are ways to get smart about doing that, and that's something that in this 5 to 15 year period of time is a good thing to learn. And there are I don't want to go into all the details, but there are resources you can read about that. And then also how to distribute your work among team members. If you're a truly self-organizing Agile team, then that should take care of itself. But as a mentor or if you're in a leadership role on the team, you might need to have a voice in that. And again, based on your experience, you need to start learning as you are a junior member of a team and you see how that happens. You want to be looking for, well, how are they doing that? How are we figuring out how to parcel out the work? Do I always parcel out the work, giving the back-end service work or the database-oriented work to this person because that's what they know how to do? Is that good for the longevity of this project and this team? Is that good for the morale of my team members? Or should I ask them, do they want to do something different, even if it slows us down and does something to our story point estimates and so forth? There's a lot that goes into that, and that's where a mentor can be very helpful. How do I divide out work and so forth? When am I supposed to stop?
We have another 20 minutes.
Okay, I don't want to keep you guys too long, and I'm getting close to done. Okay, and then the other thing is to learn to adapt and adopt new techniques. This is where I got to the point where when someone mentioned earlier the use of cloud technology, in the first 5 years you're kind of going to be doing what you're basically probably going to be doing what you're told, and obviously if you can bring new stuff to the table that you've learned and innovate, great. But more than likely there'll be more senior people who are kind of dictating more how things are going to get done. As you learn from that, as you do your own learning, when you get into this 5 to 15 year period, you want to be learning how to keep your eye open for new technologies, new techniques, be reading, keeping current. And then how do I adapt? If we've been doing, sort of heavyweight services, and we have our way of doing that. But the world is moving on towards a containerized, microservice-based approach. What are the values? What are the pros of that? What strengths does that bring? What weaknesses does it have? What is the migration strategy to get from where we are to doing that? And is it worth it? And so forth. And that's where you also get into, do I have it here? Yeah, somewhere on here. I thought I mentioned gaining business acumen. There it is, third bullet. Gaining some business acumen. And some of that's going to come by osmosis, but you also need to start learning from your managers or project managers to start, again, to benefit your career. This may not be the central focal point of what you want to do, because maybe you're a technologist and that's what you like to do, but you need to also start to understand how to think like a business person. Like if we're going to make this shift from technology A to technology B, what's the cost going to be? What's the migration strategy to get from A to B? What kind of resources are we going to need? What kind of training do we need? And yeah, you have managers and project managers who are, maybe have ownership of those decisions, but you can be a better, more effective employee and a more hireable person if you know how to think like that, because you can help give that information that maybe your manager doesn't have the technical expertise, depending on where they came from in their career. They may not have the technical expertise to know that there's a hidden cost in doing this or that they're not aware of, or there's a longer term payback that will pay for the upfront cost and so forth. So you need to start building that business acumen to know how to make a business case for either doing or not doing a thing that needs to be done. Also during this period, if this specifically addressing this comment to people who are in a position where they're working for a company that is like a more product-oriented company or has a specific service that they offer, and so that you're working in the same technical platform pretty much all the time over a span of time. It's easy, unfortunately, to get siloed and lose track of what's going on in the rest of the world if you don't intentionally focus on keeping your skill set sharp. And again, that may involve an investment of your personal time to do that. If you do that, you also may be able to help your current company, because you can bring new thought leadership into the company and maybe get them to make improvements or enhancements by adopting some new technologies that they are not using. But in addition, I don't know how many people I've interviewed who come and they have really good technical skills and they're really smart, but the gap between where they are and what they know now and what they need to learn to be effective in the organization that I'm looking at is too big. And they basically just kind of siloed themselves out of contention for a job. And again, it kind of just requires a time investment to avoid that. Any questions or comments?
You can talk on ideas on how to stay firm?
Yes, I am.
I was going to give you a suggestion for that.
Yeah.
One of the things I did early on, because I knew if you just said, okay, I'll do this.
I'm going to grab my water.
I found if you go to the publishing places like O'Reilly or Manning or those places, they're looking for book reviewers. If you say, hey, I'll review the book, they'll send you a copy of the book. You have to read the book, write reviews for it, put it up, or if you're a technical reviewer, you'll see it before it goes into publishing. And so it forces you to, because you said you're going to do this, and they sent you one, so it forces you to take the time to learn something new, review it, understand it well enough you can explain it to somebody, or say, oh, yeah, this was really good because, or I didn't get this chapter, what do they mean by this and this? It's a way to, for me, it's a way to force myself to take the time to do the things I need to do to stay up with new technologies.
Another one is if you're just going to Stack Overflow and try to answer a question on something you've never done before, and it's targeted.
And you have to go and do the research and figure it out. Yeah, that's cool.
Yep. Or contribute, if there's an open source, there's, anything in a new technology area, there's probably an open source version of something like that, and you can go and start to dig into that and possibly contribute to that project. And in the process, you'll immerse yourself in it. So that's one way.
And it's not just code to contribute, it's getting started guides.
All good.
That's
A
right.
lot of the ones I did early on with Kafka and Redis and stuff, they didn't even have basic getting started. So I just figured it out, so I'm like, all right, I'm gonna write this up, and they accepted the pull request.
Mm-hmm.
It looks kind of cool on your GitHub that I'm a committer to Redis.
Yep.
Yeah.
Damn. Well, yeah, it's a document, but
Yeah.
It's a commit.
Yeah. Yeah. You got a question?
I guess at this point is when you start looking for other jobs outside of the language that you initially got hired for. For example, I know .NET and JavaScript. I'm looking for that first position that's not .NET or JavaScript. Well, they're probably all going to be JavaScript, but what do you suggest for people trying to find that next step or the next expanding their platforms?
Yeah, I guess I would go back to, so it goes back to the slide we had earlier where you can either pick several things. If you want to start with something that's a little bit more like getting started, pick an application that's either a domain you already know or a project you want to do for yourself that uses a significant piece of a significant subset of the language. Like if you're trying to learn Java, if you know .NET but you haven't done Java, pick a project, either something you already have done in .NET and redo it in Java, or if you want to do a project that's for your own benefit. Even though there's 1,000 tools out there that you can find, you can build your own, I don't know, contact manager or something like that, or a website for something, that catalogs something that you're passionate about, some hobby or something like that. Build it in that language, actually commit it to your own source code repository and build something that's demonstrable. That would be a starting point. And then once you get to a comfort level in the language that way and have something you can demonstrate to yourself and to others, then there's no necessarily one to order this, but that might be a way to sort of get your feet on the ground and get your feet wet with the new language or the new platform. Then go look for any open source project that uses that language and, as other people have mentioned, sort of jump into that and see if you can find a piece of it, some user story or feature that's being asked for, and work on it until you get something that works and see if you can get a commit.
Or if you're really lucky to get hired by a consulting company, which I guarantee you will use more than one language within a year.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say that because also like if you're a solution architect, pre-sales, you're doing pre-sales solution architect for a product. Many times you will do cross-language work, and it's drinking from the fire hose. But if you do .NET and you get a position as consulting or into a solution architect, you may start out at .NET, but you'll be doing Java, then whatever. Then, believe it or not, it spreads to containers, and it begins this broad spread, and you get a huge survey of the world because you're dealing with customers that have different needs, and you have to come up with these speeds on that. So that's where your ability to learn quickly becomes a treasure.
Just out of curiosity, quick poll, how many of you are consultants or in a firm where you do your work by contract based on, yeah, okay.
How many have done it in the past?
Okay, and I'm assuming the rest of you who are programmers are a full-time programmer in a development organization at a company. Okay, I was just curious. If anybody wants to talk about consulting afterwards, come talk to me. And if your manager's here, pretend I didn't say that.
I'm also going to say, if you think across the stack more, right? The place where you get to play with those new languages is usually when you're trying to do those integrations. So if you're willing to jump in with the DevOps guys and help the production support guys, you will get to play with new languages. If you're willing to do the testing, you will get to play with new languages. It's not just necessarily looking for the job, it's what activities in the job I'm in give me the exposure or the chance to play with something.
Yeah.
That's always worked for me.
Yeah, and the other thing, networking, and the other thing, another bullet point that I was going to talk to on this slide is, and I don't know if your current position gives you the flexibility to do that, but if within your organization you have work that involves integrations with external services, with other older platform, other whether they're older or newer, other platforms or other applications whether you're in your own organization. One of the marks of a maturing software engineer or architect is that they understand the ins and outs of how to do effective system integration and what style of integration is appropriate in one case versus another. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each? And in the process, because the other systems that you're integrating with are, depending, and again, if it's a big organization, they're very likely going to be some legacy interfaces where you're doing batch files, and there's going to be some newer stuff, but not brand new stuff. It's going to, do, I don't know, maybe a JMS queue but whatever. The more of that kind of work you do, the more you get exposed as you're integrating with those other systems. You start to make inroads into learning other platforms. That's a good point. Yes.
So for those of you who aren't consultants, I spent 15 years working for one company, and the reason that I didn't get stuck doing this kind of stuff was I was talking to people, and I would find something that was interesting, and I would change groups. So I went from one group that was doing Delphi, and we went and I heard about Java, and I started working on the teams that were doing Java. And so I worked with like 6 different groups. So it was almost like changing jobs, but I still had my seniority, I still had all the benefits of working for the same company for 15 years. But I had the ability to learn these different things because I was looking at different groups and going, oh, that's cool. Can I do that? And so you don't have to be a consultant to have this kind of variety. You can do it staying for the same company.
I was thinking about what you said, because I mean, the challenge people have, and the reason we're so hard when we're hiring on what is your skill set and why we, people just instinctively don't take a risk and say, sure, you can learn that too, because it's that too. You have to, if one of the other ways to change is change within an industry that you know well, so that you're not having to translate the industry and the language at the same time, right? There's so many things beyond your skill set that are valuable. And we, especially, I learned that watching consulting, right? It took so long just to be able to understand what the customer's saying that if you're trying to do that and a new language, you get no sleep.
Right. But if you know the domain, the customer or your employer are going to be you're providing a lot of value by the domain knowledge you bring, so that if you're taking a little more time to come up to speed on the language of the platform, that's cool because you're providing a lot of value in a different way. So
well, I think when we go back to the networking, it's also the more you network, and if you're looking for that transition to do something new, one of the things that you learn is like if you start talking with, like after this, the best thing to do is like during this time or during beers at DevNexus is to talk with folks, find out what they're doing, and listen to what they're doing. And what happens is you say, that's a pretty cool company. Let me learn more about them. And then what you find out, like you were talking about the domain, hey, I've got this domain, but with just this tech. And a lot of times, and sometimes they'll say, well, if you know the domain, we'll be patient with you to learn the tech. But what it also does to that networking, you also say, this is a place where I would fit in the best. Versus this may be more appealing because it looks good, but I feel like I would fit in better here.
Right. And you also, along the same lines, and this goes back to the earlier comment I made about networking, is that it's helpful if you're able to change the conversation from, do you have these exact skills, to, do I see value in you for who you are as a package, right? And so that's why if you have somebody else who can vouch for you, or if you make some kind of connection to somebody at that company through a conversation or through some other common, either job experience or something that you've shared, to where they get invested in you and say, I would like to work with that person. Let's figure out how to make that happen.
That's why your resume should not be listing what you did. It's what the impact was.
Yeah.
Every intern I've had for 20 years, they put their first row of the resume and they give it to me, and I laugh at them and hand it back. Because you didn't write JavaScript. You took 10 production hours of manual QA out of every release.
Yeah.
I did? Yeah, you did. You actually didn't get that up to the last 90 days, we got a problem, but
yeah,
focus on what you did, not what you can do, not what tech you used.
Yeah, and I so rarely see this, but and it comes back to that communication skills and your writing skills. But, let people know what you accomplished. And if you can make a story out of it to make your resume not just be, this company did this, these skills, this company did this, these skills, that just puts me to sleep. And I read a lot of resumes, and God help Steve and Esther, they read 10 times more than I do. The best resume I ever got, and we tried desperately to hire this person, even though the skill set he had was not quite a match for what we needed, but we felt like he could get there even if he had a plain resume. But you guys have heard the Dos Equis commercials, the most interesting man in the world, right? This guy wrote a resume that actually touted real things he had done. For example, he wrote a new language compiler on an airplane ride from New York to Atlanta. That was one example on his resume that he actually did. And he's he's like a 3-year out of college software engineer. But his whole resume, if you think about how those Dos Equis ad, the most interesting man in the world, were written, that's how it read. And at the end, it said, he is the most interesting programmer in the world. And I'm like, hire that man.
You're reading resumes, and the people you're working with are reading resumes. 75% of resumes aren't being read by people anymore.
Right.
They're being read by AIs. And
That's
you have
exactly
to
what
list tech,
Mhm.
because that's what the AI is going to pick up on.
Right.
As a recruiter, I would love to speak to that because I get a lot of questions about resumes. And at the end of the day, there's no eliminating the fact that we use keyword searches and tools to sort through the 500 odd resumes in my inbox every day. So the best resume that's going to get my attention and the candidate that I'm going to want to call and have a conversation with and say, like, tell me the story of your career. What do you do? What are you looking for next? Is when I see the tool that they used, so whether it's a language, and then the method of how they used it and a result all next to each other. So it will pop up in my keyword search, they'll aggregate to the top of my list, and then I can immediately look at it and see that the value they created for the people they were working with and for in a sentence or a bullet point.
Yeah.
So it's easy.
And what I've done, and like I said, full disclosure, I haven't had to look for a job in 17 years. But even back then, the last time I looked for a job, at that time I had, 18 years of experience already. That's how old I am. What I did, because I was kind of getting the dual arguments, right? People want to see everything you've done because they want to see if you've done X, Y, and Z, and they want to see, hopefully they want, it's important that they see a contiguous career history and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, if it's landing on the desk of a real person who just wants to see who you are, they want something that's more sort of like that tells a story. So what I did is I did 2 resumes and I would send them together. And the first one looked like a cover page, so it didn't look unnatural. And it was basically, I called it like executive summary. And that's the one where I told a story about this is who I am and what I've done on one page, and it wasn't cramped. I didn't jam a bunch of stuff in there. And then the next part was however many pages it was, and it went through every project the way you were describing, where it listed, the company, the tools used, what we did, what it accomplished. So you can do both so that you don't kill yourself by having a resume that doesn't surface the right skills in an automated search, but still have the other piece there. Yeah. Well, I do it for LinkedIn and I do it for Doherty every time I finish a project. So.
January 1st. Take a step back, go, okay, time to update the resume and the LinkedIn, because what did I do last year?
Yeah, for me, it's every time I finish a project. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Something that was recommended to me, I was informed by a couple of people on the Coding Block Slack that once I learned how to build a web page, I should make a blog. One that explains all the things that I'm doing, how I'm getting through problems on a day-by-day basis, when I'm meeting them outside of a job, or just things that I'm tinkering with. And they said it's good to show employers how you work through problems with that blog, with your post, and explaining it to the world. And they said it's even better because you can put all those little references that you're gonna forget. That's one Stack Overflow article. You can be like, oh yeah, it was on this blog day. I'll just Google that instead of going through all the other searches that got me there.
That's also the advice we give to the interns. when you mentioned LinkedIn, add everybody that you meet there. I actually tell them counter. 3 people, no more than 3 people. You've been in that internship for 90 days, 180 maybe. You're not going to tag every person. Pick a handful of them to get your review, but also start putting in there every class, what did you do? So I took compilers this week. It solved this interesting problem. The reason is it bubbles them up, and this also applies to the first couple of years in a job. It bubbles you up in the LinkedIn view, so when everybody else logs in, you're near the top. And when the question comes up, boy, we're looking for a junior developer. Anybody know anybody? You're just kind of flipping around through LinkedIn at the end of the day, you're like, oh, I forgot about Todd. He was there 2 years ago, we loved him. Because he just talked about the compiler class he just took. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna call him.
Yeah, that's good. And whether this is related to the comment about the counter advice, which I understand. One thing that I don't do when I'm leaving a client, because I don't want to hit like 25 or 50 people with a LinkedIn request all on the same day, because it just seems kind of gauche, is I do sort of parcel it out. I pick the people that I was closest to, because that's a logical thing to do. And then I sort of put a tickler in my to-do list to go back and just check back and look at who else I knew. But I do try to get everybody, because you never know when that one person's no longer going to be there, but they're going to be somewhere else.
Yeah. The counter with the interns has always been, when I'm a recruiter or I'm looking to hire and I look at, so you interviewed with IBM, you were there for 90 days. Why did you friend 90 people, or whatever the LinkedIn term is, in those 90 days? Come on, but it wasn't very professional.
Yeah.
The 3 that you actually worked with because you were there for 90 days, those are the people I want to see. What they think.
Yeah, fair point. So, yeah.
Just want to add one point to the blog, right? So suppose if you're putting your day-to-day work in the blog, right, there could be some sensitive information that you may be putting. Say, for example, you upload some security-related class, say like Struts1, right? You update your blog, say that your company uses Struts1, and someone can come and attack your site if they know security loophole. So just need to be very careful, and that's one part of it. And another part of it is like you are not supposed to put all the work that you do for the company on the public domain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just want to add that.
Good caution. You had a question?
So we talked a little bit about technical mentorship.
Yeah.
But what's your opinion on getting someone from outside of the technical staff to mentor you?
Do it. Can't hurt, right? I mean, if it's somebody you respect, if it's somebody who has accomplished something that you see value in, absolutely. You know.
If you're looking for that, go find yourself a sales guy.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest the same kind of thing. Is one of the things as technical people, we get so focused on us, but we don't really necessarily know how to sell ourselves or promote ourselves. If you're around sales and marketing people, I mean, that's what they do. I mean, we tell jokes or like make snide comments about, oh yeah, those guys, you know, oh, they have sold their soul, now they're sales, and you know, they can't trust anything they say. But you know, that's a skill, and that's something that, you know, is out of most of our comfort zones. But you know, it's kind of good to push yourself.
Yeah.
And move around a lot.
Well, I was going to say that the sales pipe people I worked with when I did pre-sales. Every last one of them I worked with, I've kept up in touch with them, and they jump all over the place, and usually they jump, hey, Glenn.
Yeah. You're not going to believe what I just walked into. Come help.
Come on, come on over. I thought you were here. I'm back over here now.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting.
Okay, I think I've covered everything on this slide. So now let's go to 15 plus years of experience, and that 15, you know, again, the number could move. It could be 20 plus, 15, or 25 plus. But when you're a very senior person in this field, this is additional stuff, like do everything else we talked about first, because that all still applies. Staying current, staying abreast of what, you know, adding new skills to your toolkit and so forth. So here's the things I would look for as the next stage in your career, whatever number of years it is. Ability to lead, and this is where mentoring comes in. You know, you had asked earlier, was I going to talk about it? So how to motivate people. If you're an introvert, motivation may not be like, there is a particular customer of ours, I will not name it, in town that has a very rah-rah environment. And when I walk in the morning and their managers of one of their departments are throwing confetti and cheering the employees as they walk in, I cringe and go get my coffee. That's not my style of motivation, but not everybody has to have the same style of motivation. But one of the things that you want to be accumulating as you're going from a junior programmer and then progressing in your career, especially if it doesn't come naturally for you, is what were the team situations that I found myself in that were the most positive? Who were the mentors and the leaders, technical leaders or other leaders who I had the most fun working for, and wouldn't have thought twice maybe of going the extra mile to get something done for them or for that team, and then think about what made it that way. And you can read books about this. There's a good book by Daniel Pink called Drive that kind of gets into the science of what motivates people. Lots of literature, probably some good, and there's probably a lot that's not. But there's ways to go learn and read about this. But to me, there's a more practical way, which is to figure out what worked for me and why did it work, and then see if what is within your comfort zone, within those things if you've observed that made for a good work environment for you and that motivated you to want to do your best and learn the most and all that, and basically make that a part of your tool set in terms of how you can motivate and create good team environments for other people. So coming up with your own approach to motivating people of different types, introverts, extroverts, from different cultures, learn that as you go and kind of be intentional in thinking about that. It's one of those background things that you kind of don't think about, but maybe set a reminder for yourself weekly or monthly or something to just think about, what have the team dynamics been in my organization over the last period of time since I last thought about this? What's been good? What's been bad? Whatever was bad, how do I not replicate that anti-pattern? How can I avoid that if I ever have the opportunity to have a say in it, or if I do have a say in it? And then conversely, what worked? What was good? What made it good? And how can I replicate that? So basically develop that within yourself and figure out how you're able to motivate people in your own unique way. Learn how to recognize talent, from junior engineers to people who may not be in a technical role who actually have very strong technical strengths, and you can possibly pull them into that. People who are in a technical role who may be struggling at it but have other skills, and you might be able to recommend a different direction for their career where they'll be happy and they'll thrive. So things like that, recognizing talent, learning how to nurture talent, being a mentor, and being able to share the wisdom you have with other people to help them in their career. Already talked about fostering a team environment, and then again, learning how to organize and distribute work on a larger scale on a bigger team.
So then recognize and nurture. I have a story that I love. We had a lady who worked in the cafeteria. Was the best, most interactive person I have ever seen work in a cash register. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of us noticed and convinced her to go apply for a frontline customer support job. Mm-hmm. She's like, I can't do that. We're like, trust us, you'll be good at this. Mm-hmm. And she did. Mm-hmm. Talk about a change in income and lifestyle where she went from cashier to, took a lot of training because she didn't have any technical background, but she was one that a bunch of us noticed that I would love to have her talk to that client, because look at the way she just dealt with the guy who got pissed off because he didn't have a full soda.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Okay. All right. So again, broadening horizons, continue doing all of the above. Continue learning additional platforms, languages, because at this point in your career, you've been in it 10, 15 plus years. There have been about 5 seismic changes in technology already. So you have to learn new languages. Let's see. Continue building more business acumen, because there's sort of an implicit assumption if you're managing your career well, at this point, you will be interacting probably with much more senior level people in the company. Instead of dealing with your manager and your manager's manager, you're dealing with directors, you're dealing with senior directors and VPs. And so, your understanding of how technology fits into the business and can be a lever for profit or a lever to reduce cost or whatever, you need to help yourself learn to think like that and build that acumen as you go, where probably most of your focus is on staying technically current and all that. But if you're doing that, one of the things you want to do as a senior individual is be able to take all that additional stuff that you're learning and figure out, how will this impact the business if we adopt it? or how will it hurt us if we don't, and so forth. Always stay current and network. Now, somebody asked, am I going to talk about how to stay current? Yes, I am. So first of all, a lot of the things that we've already talked about setting a goal in some particular technology, going and exploring that, and actually building something that is demonstrable and usable in whatever technology or language or whatever that you want to learn, that still applies. But in terms of where you get the information and how do I figure out even what I want to learn next, what do I need to learn next, if I polled the room, like maybe I have had everybody write down their top 5 sources on a piece of paper, I'd probably get back about 60 different answers to this question. And that's something that you all as a group probably have shared before, I imagine, in some forum somewhere. This is sort of the go-to that I look to. The best site for me in terms of really kind of getting a feel from my perspective, my own personal opinion for what is sort of on the leading edge out there is that one, InfoQ. That seems to be focusing on the latest stuff in cloud technology, the latest stuff in DevOps. It's focusing on big companies that are sort of the emerging story. It was Netflix for a while, it was Spotify for a while, and a lot of other smaller companies that are Silicon Valley darlings that are really pushing the boundaries of technology and adopting new technology. You can find hour-long videos on there from InfoQ conferences, I could call them QCon, and articles left and right. And you can pick among a whole bunch of different topics from just basically software engineering and Java to big data to whatever. So that's sort of my favorite go-to on it. And I get posts from InfoQ, just an email, telling me what new information is out there on the topics that I'm interested in. I think I get them about every 2 to 3 days. So it's not information overload, and I can go look at the ones I want to. So that's my favorite. Some other ones that are good, just basic news in the tech industry, Ars Technica, TechCrunch are good. Actually, it's feels kind of clunky and old school, like old man stuff, but I actually like, and I don't like the listicles and the things that you have to click through 20 pages slide by slide. That drives me bonkers. But there are some good articles in here that talk about trends, or if I don't know a lot about a particular topic and I want to hear, I feel like it may be 6-month-old news, but if I want to hear what CIOs were talking about 6 months ago, I feel like sometimes I get some good high-level stuff in here. And then if I want to know more, I go to another source. But I still get a subscription where I get like an email a day from InfoWorld, which I started way, way back. Tyobe Index, I check that like every 3 months or 6 months. I checked it before I did this presentation because I just wanted to see what had changed in the last few months. But I'm curious, I always like to look at that because I like to see what languages are trending, that kind of thing. I had heard that Python had risen greatly in 2018. I was surprised to find it was like the number 3 most popular language in 2018, which is kind of cool. And then basically absorb a basic library of classics. So if you're, things like clean code, clean architecture, design patterns, and there's, 100 other books. Ask around, yeah.
I was going to say the Martin Fowler refactoring book was like a life changer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a good one. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Do you use an RSS reader?
I used to. Somewhere as I was changing laptops, I kind of lost my RSS feeds, and so
I use Feedly. The thing I like about Feedly is that you can find a one-off article like Netflix's blog that they used to publish like 3-4 times a week. They're down now to once every couple of weeks. Throw it into Feedly, and you can forget about having to go look at their Netflix page every once in a while to figure it out.
Yeah.
It just shows up.
Yeah.
I would also say like follow Martin Fowler, Dave Sire, people on Twitter, and they'll post when they're something that they've written or whatever, but also they'll retweet things from other people that you may want to follow, and you build up a bevy of people that you will follow, and it's great reading in the morning just to kind of get that 40 character, oh, that's an interesting article, or that's an interesting article that they thought was interesting. And it's a great way to track it. So I know Twitter's evil, but actually in the morning it's really good.
Ironically, I had not thought I agree. Twitter is evil. And I had actually not, because Twitter is evil, I hadn't thought of using it to get technical information. But I actually do the same thing, and I don't want to wander too far in this direction. But I use it to get my news in the following way. I picked like 2 or 3 reporters whose reporting I tended to gravitate toward, and I dropped everything else I was following on Twitter and started following those 2 or 3 reporters. And then they would post stuff from other publications, and I would go and take a look at some of those, and then I'd follow 2 or 3 more. And eventually, I basically built up my own newspaper by the publications and the writers whose work I liked. And so it's the same thing, basically. Yeah.
One of the great Twitter challenges to if you want to see the other side of things is to go find people who have nothing in common with you.
Yeah.
And follow them and see something completely different.
It's true.
And start to see patterns that you never realized there were connections for.
Yep. My head would explode, but that's a really good idea. But that's a really good idea. All right. If anybody else have any like, I got to tell people about this way to keep current, because there's literally hundreds of ways.
Because one other thing that I told people who just graduated or still looking for jobs is to start with the various demos out there, especially spring. Mm-hmm. You could spend weeks working your way through all the spring demos, and when the recruiter goes, "So what have you been doing since you graduated?" Drinking beer isn't the answer. It's this week I did. Last week I did. The week before I did.
Yeah.
And we spend a lot of time on those demos.
Yeah. And so do just about everybody else. That goes back to the open source. If you find a cool open source that doesn't have a good getting started, go write it.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking from the open source community, documentation is a well received and well appreciated contribution to our projects. And I work on.
What, developers don't like to document?
Developers like to document it based on how they are thinking.
Yeah.
And when you, as a completely different thinker, come across it and go, "I just don't get this," and then you figure it out.
Yeah, a lot of developers don't like to document.
No, but I'll put it this way: you'd be surprised at the number of times that we get document PRs, and they'll say, "I've seen this error," and I'll just. In that one case, if I get a person that reports a bug in the code, and they say, "I found it here," I'm like, "Can you contribute back?" "No, I can't," or they don't. Mm-hmm. But if I say they report a document bug and say, "Hey, can you fix it?" A couple hours later, they feel more confident. So if you're looking for entry level into open source community, answer questions on Stack Overflow, submit bug fixes, new articles, or updates to documentation. I guarantee you, the open source community project will appreciate it and will get merged.
And not just newbies.
No, anybody.
As long as you have, and I still do it, because I just learned something, so let's share.
Right. And they're contrary to the stereotype, and there's a reason why stereotypes exist, right? But they're developers. One thing that's always surprised me over time as I get to know, get past, this is someone who is fulfilling a technical role, and you get to know people individually and start to just you get to know them well enough that they're willing to share stuff that's personal about themselves. I mean, I've run into developers who were smart as a whip, and they just seemed like they were all about the technology, and they love poetry. They're passionate about poetry, classic poetry. They go to poetry slams downtown at some place, I don't know, or in Decatur or whatever. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know about that side of you. And personally, I'm somebody who, I'm not a creative writer, but I love reading all that kind of poetry and literature and stuff. And I find I have these commonalities with other people. And when it comes to if I have the time and I can do something like that, like getting started or whatever, I actually really enjoy that process of crafting, of the wordsmanship of it. I really enjoy that. I like writing a good email. I know that's insane, but I do. So, it takes all kinds. And if you have that skill and you can contribute to an open source project or something, I mean, the more skills, the more well-rounded you are, the easier it is to get a job. Okay. I'm at the end, unless anybody has any other questions I have
a question not for you.
Okay.
You've done a great job.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it.
Sure. Glad to do it.